I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Cannabis Media. This is our live Business of Cannabis talk show, and we've got a few new faces in our talk set, our talk room for this half hour at least. Jessilyn Dolan, our friend from Vermont, who's a registered nurse and also a contributor to the Weed Talk News Show. Jessilyn, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, the host of the American Cannabis Report, it's Christopher Smith. Christopher, good to see you.
Jimmy, how are you? Good to see you.
Good, good, good. So since Josh has already given his impressions of the MORE Act passing today, the U.S. House of Representatives, I'm sure that's not news to either one of you at this point. If it is, I excuse to put you on the spot here, but I'd love to get your reaction. Christopher, I'll let you go first.
Oh, thanks. Well, of course, it's always encouraging to see that cannabis is getting attention at all on the federal level. We think that's excellent. We think that the MORE Act is way more comprehensive than the Safe Banking Act. It handles a lot more. I'm trying to find my camera. There it is. That the MORE Act is comprehensive. It talks about expungement. It talks about many other layers, many of the other important elements or aspects of what we're trying to deal with, including descheduling, for example. Whether or not it gets any further than today, of course, is the $64,000 question. But the fact that it's gotten a positive result, I think, can only bode well for all the other things we're trying to do.
I just want to see if it actually makes the network news. Jessilyn, what's your impressions of the House passing the MORE Act today?
I'm not surprised at all. I'm excited to see that it's passed the House. I think we all know that there's a very good chance that it will be held up in the Senate, and the viability of it actually passing isn't as positive as we would like to see. But I do think, as Christopher mentioned, for the state of cannabis at a national level, it's great that it's actually made it this far. We're talking about it. Do I expect it to pass? Not necessarily, but hopefully it's a good starting point to continue conversations. And hopefully those conversations in future legislative sessions will actually lead to, in my opinion, a better bill than what's out right now.
Very cool. Very cool. And Josh, can I ask you, when you read the reports, how did you know that it was going to be scheduled to Schedule 2? Because I'm still looking for that information.
No, Jimmy, I was just putting out a concern that even if this does pass, that if Schedule 2 were to happen, it would put us at a disadvantage by making it for pharmacy only.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Agreed, Josh. That would be a disaster. Agreed. Yeah.
Right. I knew Christopher was going to chime in. I didn't even have to prompt him this time, which was great. There was another, we talk a little bit about media perception of the plant. And there was a report on CNN, I'm pretty sure it was last week, Christopher, about the Harvard medical professor and teacher, or that would be a teacher, professor and doctor out of Harvard, who has got, national recognition for a research study that she did. You want to take us through this a little bit, set this up, and then I want Jessilyn's opinion about the conclusions of this. Jessilyn, are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Yeah, I figured
Absolutely.
You did. Go ahead, Christopher, because this is your time to rant. Go ahead.
Well, first question is now, are S-bombs allowed, or F-bombs perhaps? Because
this is an adult only, supposedly, show.
Okay.
So if you want to, if it's important to you as a professor and someone who teaches broadcast journalism, I always think there are other words you could use that mean the same thing. So just like freaking. You get what I'm saying.
Well, just as long as I don't storm the stage and slap somebody, I think I'm probably doing a little better than
I've had enough of the slaps. Thank you very much. Doing
better than most of the other Smiths who are involved in this sort of thing. So I'll just keep it light. First of all, Jimmy, I was, as you know, I read the story on the news last week when it first launched. I wrote it up. And also, one of my biggest concerns was when a story that's like this is so chock full of propaganda and awful non-factual assumptions and bad science, it is just a horrifying idea that it's going to get the national recognition that it ultimately has. The fact that it's on CNN now, to me, is really very sad. It's a sad statement about CNN, a sad statement about how non-facts are trickling up to the national conversation. What the test purported, what the study, I'm going to do a lot of finger quotes, what the study from Harvard and the Journal of the American Medical Association purported to be studying was what happens if a medical card is given out, and what are the results of that? And this was done with a very, very small group in Boston only, 186 participants, which is hardly a study worthy of Harvard or the Journal of Medical Association.
I think it was 269,
people.
Christopher. I have 269. Go ahead.
That is not much bigger, but you get the idea. Anyway,
I get the idea.
A very small, localized study, allegedly. Half of them were given a medical card, and half of them had to wait 12 weeks to get a medical card. And so the first test was, the first conclusion that they came to was that the people who got a medical card were more likely to develop a cannabis use disorder than the ones who didn't have a card. Well, everyone in the world knows that cannabis has approximately a 9% addiction rate. 9% of people who use it will end up getting addicted to it. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that alcohol is much higher. Cocaine, heroin are off the charts somewhere. The cannabis is the least addictive. And I always include sugar in that list. So cannabis is addictive at a small 9% rate. We know that's going to happen. And so that's what they ended up saying was that 50% of the participants developed a cannabis use disorder. And so if you're taking data and you get an outlier that's 5 times higher than any other data out there, you call it an outlier. You don't call that the conclusion, you call it an outlier. So that's number one. Number two was that the participants, and I say it again, I don't know if they're patients or not, but the participants self-diagnosed. So when they came in, the doctor said, "What's your problem?" And one said, "I have chronic pain, I have anxiety, I have depression." So they self-diagnosed, and the doctors who were in charge just simply wrote it down. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had an anxiety disorder, I'm not sure if I could diagnose that myself. I don't know if any doctor, even a doctor could, I don't know. But pretty good chance that I would guess wrong, or that I would misunderstand if I have depression, if I have anxiety, if I have something else, because mental health is so nuanced. Right. So they self-diagnosed. And then after that, they were allowed to get a cannabis card and then go out and buy cannabis and buy whatever they wanted, take as much as they wanted or as little, with no control whatsoever. And then at the end of that process, the conclusion was reached that cannabis didn't work for any of these patients except for the ones with sleep.
Right.
So no control coming in, no control during the process, no control over the medicine or the administration of the medicine, no control whatsoever. We're just going to say, oh, this obviously didn't work. So
gotcha. Good,
very disappointing.
Good opening salvo. I love that. We have a professional medical person in our panel today. Let's talk to Jessilyn. Tell us your impressions of this study, and then I'm going to give you my doctor, Dr. Ryan Zacklin's quote that he sent me. Go ahead.
Oh, that's great. So, as a research nurse, the one thing I have learned is to question our research based on who's funding the study, what the potential hypothesis that we're looking for and going for is. And when I see this study, the first thing I look at is who is the doctor. The doctor is a doctor that specializes in addiction. As we know, most of the research we have here in the US, which is anti-cannabis, is through NIDA, which again is addiction associates who are looking to prove the negative impacts of cannabis. So we're starting off from that level right off the bat. As Christopher mentioned, these weren't patients who were seeing a doctor with a treatment care plan. These were people who were thrown a medical card with no support, no education. So we know how important education is. There's also no information specifying what types of cannabis did they use. Did they use edibles? Did they use one-to-ones? Did they use high potency distillates and dabs and concentrates? So we don't have the information that we really need to have. When I look at addiction and substance use altogether, I've specialized in opioid use disorder for a very long time. For someone to talk about cannabis as an addiction because they might have a little bit of craving or irritability, that is extremely different from someone with substance use disorder who actually will do physically hazardous things to ensure that they continue to take that substance, who will blow off social and professional obligations, who will have life obligations that fall off. So when we just look at the idea of addiction, we're looking at two very different areas, and we're calling addiction what is possibly maybe just a little tolerance and dependence, which is not abnormal for any therapeutic medication or prescribed pharmaceutical. So that's the first thing I saw in this study. So when I saw this study, I was just very discouraged, as Christopher said, that we're putting out misinformation at a large national level.
Yeah.
Jimmy, I just came back from Israel to present and publish some research. We could not get that research published here in the United States because it's basically not anti-cannabis enough. So when we look at the idea of what is getting published here and why, we have to look at the bigger picture of the stigmatized system and broken medical facilities and programs based around cannabis that we're starting from. So in my mind, this is just another way of reiterating why we need to decriminalize, deschedule, and if not legalize, so that we can actually have real data, have research that is not specifically to demonize this plant medicine and look only at the negative impact. So that's exactly where I come from the first. And some of the things really did catch me. They're talking about outside regulatory standards. Well, of course, cannabis is outside regulatory standards because they've made that federally the only option. So when they're using that in a negative connotation and not talking about why it's outside regulatory standards, they're feeding into that reefer madness and that fear of the plant. And as a research nurse, the other thing I've learned is you can read 10 research studies, pick apart a couple different sentences and paragraphs, piece it together to then reiterate it and make it sound like you want to.
Right. Now I'm going to read you. There are two paragraphs that Dr. Ryan Zachlin gave me in response to this study. The first one supports a lot what you said too, Christopher. Not one of these study members had physician guidance. That's like saying they let 269 people loose in a room full of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications and telling them to choose whatever they want. This study comments only on what happens when patients with zero guidance explore the use of a medication with a common intoxicating and disorienting side effect to treat a complex condition that requires a multifaceted approach, including medication and therapy. Cannabis has a synergistic effect on medications, and perhaps with a clinical evaluation, lower doses of medication and cannabis can be combined for a more effective therapy. Then his concluding paragraph is next, but Josh is back with us. Josh, did you see this study on CNN by any chance?
No, I haven't seen it, but it sounds interesting if they're actually talking about it on corporate media. I didn't see it on CNN, but I saw the headline of it, and I know it's making its way around. And it's unfortunate too, because if it's not one syndrome, it's another. My mom was talking to me months ago. Oh, you got to quit because of the issue with nausea and vomiting. I forget what hyperemesis syndrome. Right. Thank you. Yeah. So you get these kind of
Dr. Smith.
Yeah, you get these hit pieces that come out every once in a while, and it kind of just takes the majority to tell everybody to settle down and get maybe a bigger data set than 280 or whatever it is. In college there was a book, How to Lie with Statistics. It's really easy to do. It's not difficult.
Right.
That's what I've learned as a research nurse.
Right.
And who was making the diagnosis of cannabis use disorder? That's very different when it's an ER doc versus your primary care doc that knows you versus a doctor who's doing a study and is anti-cannabis. So really, we need to ask a lot of questions, and questions that we're not necessarily going to have the answer to. And the typical American does not know to question or wonder.
Yeah,
I think that's so right, Jessilyn. If you read what the description of cannabis use disorder that they used in this study, it's so nebulous and so impossible to pin down. You couldn't even imagine it could be applied.
right.
But they did find positive outcomes, right? They saw a positive correlation with sleep. What we know from the mental health perspective, Jimmy, as you mentioned, it's very complex and not easy to treat. How long did they follow these patients? Because if you follow a mental health patient that their first positive effect is better sleep, give it another month or a couple more months, and that's going to also help their anxiety and depression. So we can't write it off immediately. We need to have a little more patience and support for our patients.
Right. Now I'm going to read you the first two sentences of the last paragraph. The only thing this study truly informs us of is the desperate need for cannabis therapeutic clinicians and more visibility and availability at dispensaries for cannabis therapeutics. The certificate mills are a big part of this problem and only perpetuate it, which means he recognizes, by the way, this is the doctor, he's integrative medicine, MD, and yes, he is my doctor. Okay, who gives me my card, but trust me, I qualify. Anybody who watches this show knows I'm ADHD. Okay, so let's face it. I just kicked the camera again. See, there I go. The study elucidates the need for further guidance in using cannabis to treat anxiety and mood disorders, coupled with a relook at the Massachusetts medical marijuana program to explore how guidance can be made more readily available to medical patients. Dr. Ryan Zachman, that's his words. He sent that to me and he told me I could read it. So I just did. And what bothers me, being an old media guy, is that CNN will give this a exposure to a national audience, and then it gets picked up by other national publications. And there's no balancing story about the positive therapeutic effects of this plant. Jessilyn, I know this bothers you, right?
Oh, absolutely. And again, they're picking evidence and information to put out with a specific hypothesis that they intended from the start. So when we don't know the initial hypothesis, we don't know which direction the study is headed. And what I've learned also as a research nurse is if your hypothesis isn't close to your outcome, then you might have funders that don't want to continue funding that research. So it really kind of can become a little vicious cycle. And we're right in the middle of that with the stigmatized plant.
Right. Now, Christopher, I'm going to ask you a question that I asked a guy named Dr. Peter Grinspoon, who I know Jessilyn knows. And I asked him this question: what is the difference between an addiction and a dependency? In your opinion, what is the difference between addiction and dependency?
Well, not being a doctor at all, but having some family experience in this kind of thing, I would say that addiction and dependency, I think maybe Jessilyn said it a little bit better, which is just a moment ago, and ask her, follow up with her, of course, she's qualified to answer it. But the difference between an addiction and an urge, let's say, the difference between, let's say, a tobacco or an alcohol addiction versus when you haven't got your cup of coffee yet and you're feeling irritable. Or if you're using crystal meth, for example, and you're willing to rob or hurt somebody to get your meth, to get the drug back in your system, versus, oh, I really wish I had some, which is a far, I don't want to say mellow, but it's a far reduced kind of a reaction. So we have, I think, a physical addiction to certain things, and maybe an emotional want or emotional need, which is something, but I just don't think it's in the same category.
Right. So this is what Peter Grinspoon explained to me, and it's probably the best explanation about this, I think, anyway. An addiction is something, you need something that affects negative behavior for you to keep going back to that substance. So you lose your job, your relationship breaks up, you get in a car accident. These are negative things. A dependency is when you recognize what this does for you, and you are dependent on getting to that spot. Jessilyn, he said that in medical schools, psychologists anyway, they debate this all the time. Addiction versus dependency. How do you look at those two words?
Specializing in opioid use disorder in pregnancy and infancy withdrawal for a very long time, I've started to simplify it, mostly because I'm very sensitive to the language we use and speak about people who struggle with addiction and substance use disorder. So when I talk to people about it, I go to my babies. We would never call a baby an addict. We would only call a baby dependent. And the reason is they have the physiological dependence, but not the psychological addiction. So addiction includes the psychological, it takes over your mind component, which a baby cannot have, but of course an adult can, right? Where the physiological is just your body saying, wow, wait a minute, I feel this substance, there's a change happening, I need this substance, but you don't allow your mind to take over. And as Christopher mentioned, literally go rob a store to continue using this substance. So I kind of look at it from that baby perspective. So again, just to reiterate, we would never call babies addicts ever.
Right. Great point. Josh, you want to chime in here? I'll let you chime in here about addiction versus dependency.
Well, I just think it's interesting that this study kind of came out with the anecdotal evidence of just a couple of folks saying how they felt, and then media is running with it when we have, dozens and dozens of decades of experience of millions of us users talking about it, and that's gone nowhere. So really it's about the narrative and whoever is biased behind that report. Having said that, anybody who is using Tylenol every day is going to have their own issues. I had a friend who used 12 of them a day, got multiple sclerosis and died. And I think that's, I'm no doctor, but I think that probably had something to do with it.
Right.
So when I stop using it and I go through, sober October, and I give myself a monthly cleanse or whatever, and my wife's like, is the month over yet? I could get a little grumpy. There could be some, issues like people don't get their coffee or whatever, and that's okay. Oh, I haven't got my coffee yet. That's why I screwed up on the email. And corporate America dismisses that all the time. It's hilarious, the hypocrisy that goes with that. When I don't have my cannabis and I'm grumpy, or my shoulder aches if I don't get CBG in my coffee in the morning, or whatever cannabinoid I'm taking for whatever ailment, if I don't take it, I'm an addict. I think our society has a lot more issues, and we're throwing stones in glass houses more than we should.
Right, 100%. And again, I'm going to point my finger at the media. Balance that story with a story, cannabis saved my life, cannabis changed my life. There are thousands out there. Do your job. Find them. We know who they are. How many times, guys, in this call, have you heard someone say, cannabis has saved my life, cannabis changed my life? Jessilyn?
Oh, absolutely. Every day I had someone tell me that. Just today, they texted me that.
All right. Christopher?
Every day. Almost every single person that I talk to, the first question I'll ask them is, how did you get into this business? Of all the things you could do, how did you get in this business? And almost every single person has a very, very personal anecdote about how, just like you said, cannabis saved my life, cannabis fixed what was broken, cannabis allows me to function.
Josh?
I've seen plenty of get highs, people who just enjoy, what it does. I've seen plenty of carpetbaggers who want money in the industry, but the majority of the folks like myself were running away from big pharma and just found cannabis. And I think for a lot of us, that's the reality that we live in is cannabis is something that we found. It wasn't just something that we enjoyed because of the party nature of it or whatever. This is kind of a therapeutic thing that we use in our everyday life. Right. I use it every day, and I'm still able to communicate and interact with folks. And I'm certainly not lazy. I'm up at 5 talking to people in Dubai, and first thing I do is use cannabis with ailments that I have. I'm physically broken, and cannabinoids is what keeps me going.
I may have to call you to get what your recipe is because I'm physically broken as well. Appreciate it.
With that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is The Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out. Don't forget to smash that like button on your way out and check out these other videos that we've got.